Okay, so we will be reading Chapter 1 of Writing Literature Reviews, a guide for students of the Social and Behavioral Sciences, Edition 7. This is week 1 reading. Chapter 1 is going to first start by reviewing primary sources. They're going to start with empirical research reports. Then it's going to go over theoretical articles. Next, literature review articles. Next, anecdotal reports. And finally, reports on professional practices and standards. It'll kind of give you some guidelines, pros and cons of each. Next, it's going to go through the writing process, starting with trying to help you identify the writer's voice. And then it's going to talk about the different types of writing. So for a term paper in class, and then writing a literature review chapter for a thesis or dissertation, and then writing for a research article, basically describing the 3 different types of writing. Finally, it's going to go into the approach, how the book explains the approach of this project overall. So starting with how to manage your literature search, and then how to analyze the literature, so about 4 chapters on that, and then how to write your first draft, and then in the end, how to edit and prepare the final draft. And then it ends with some activities that you need to do to pull your own report and analyze it based on what you learned in this chapter. And then the second prompt question is going to have you look at the review that they provided and then do some questions on that. Chapter 1: Reading Reviews of Academic Literature and Overview. This book is a guide to the specialized requirements of writing a literature review for the social and behavioral sciences. In using this book, you will learn how to write a review of the literature using primary, original sources of information. 5 different types of sources are discussed here. By far, the most common primary sources are 1. Reports of empirical research published in academic journals. The first subheading in the section that follows refers to this type of source. It is followed by brief descriptions of 4 other types of material found in journals. 2. Theoretical articles. 3. Literature review articles. 4. Anecdotal reports. And 5. Reports on professional practices and standards. The second major section of this chapter consists of an overview of the writing process that you will use as you prepare your review, and it mirrors the organization of the book into its 4 main parts. An introduction to reviewing primary sources. Empirical research reports. The focus of this book is on original reports of research found in academic journals. We say they are original because they are the first published accounts of particular sets of research findings. As such, they are considered primary sources of information, detailing the methodology used in the research and in-depth descriptions and discussions of the findings. In contrast, research summaries reported in textbooks, popular magazines, and newspapers, as well as on television and radio, are usually secondary sources, which typically provide only global descriptions of results with few details of the methodology used to obtain them. Furthermore, secondary sources are often incomplete, sometimes inaccurate, and their purpose tends to be more to garner casual readers' interest than to engage scholars' consideration and scrutiny. As scholars, you will want to emphasize primary sources when you review the literature on a particular topic. In fact, your instructor may require you to cite primary sources exclusively in your written reviews of literature. Journals in the social and behavioral sciences abound with original reports of empirical research. The term empirical refers to observation, while the term empirical research refers to systematic observation. Research is systematic when researchers plan whom to observe, what characteristics to observe, how to observe, and so on. While empirical research is the foundation of any science, one could reasonably argue that all empirical research is inherently flawed. Hence, the results obtained through research should be interpreted with caution. For instance, the following is a list of 3 major issues that arise in almost all empirical studies and the problems they pose for reviewers of research. Issue 1, sampling. Most researchers study only a sample of individuals and infer that the results apply to some larger group, often called the population. Furthermore, most researchers use samples with some kind of bias that makes them unrepresentative of the population of interest. For instance, suppose a professor conducted research using only students in his or her introductory psychology class. Or suppose a researcher mailed a questionnaire and obtained only a 40% return from recipients. Clearly, these examples may or may not be representative of the population of interest. In the first instance, the professor may be interested only in describing the behaviors of students in his class. But if his interest is in generalizing to a wider population, the limitations of his population need to be noted. Problem: the reviewer needs to consider the possibility of errors in sampling when interpreting the results of a study. Deciding how much trust to put in the results of a study based on a flawed sample is a highly subjective judgment. Issue 2, measurement. Almost all measures in empirical research should be presumed to be flawed to some extent. For instance, suppose a researcher uses a self-report questionnaire to measure the incidence of marijuana use on a campus. Even if respondents are assured that their responses are confidential and anonymous, some might not want to reveal their illegal behavior. On the other hand, others might be tempted to brag about doing something illegal, even if they seldom or never do it. So what are the alternatives? One may conduct personal interviews, but this measurement technique also calls for revelation of an illegal activity. Another alternative is cohort observation, but this technique might be unethical. On the other hand, if the observation is not covert, participants might change their behavior because they know they are being observed. As you can see, there is no perfect solution. Problem: a reviewer needs to consider the possibility of measurement error. Ask yourself whether the method of measurement seems sound. Did the researcher use more than one method of measurement? If so, do the various methods yield consistent results? Issue 3, problem identification. Researchers usually examine only part of a problem, often just a very small part. Here is an example. Suppose a researcher wants to study the use of rewards in the classroom and their effect on creativity. This sounds manageable as a research problem until one considers that there are many kinds of rewards, many kinds and levels of praise, many types of prize objects that may be given, and so on. Another issue is that there are many different ways in which creativity can be expressed. For instance, creativity is expressed differently in the visual arts, in dance, and in music. Creativity can be expressed in the physical sciences, in oral expression, in written communication, and so on. No researcher has the resources to examine all of these forms. Instead, he or she will probably have to select only 1 or 2 types of rewards and only 1 or 2 manifestations of creativity and examine them in a limited number of classrooms. Problem: a reviewer needs to synthesize the various research reports on narrowly defined problems in a given area, looking for consistencies and discrepancies from report to report while keeping in mind that each researcher defined his or her problem in a somewhat different way. Because empirical research provides only approximations and degrees of evidence on which research problems that are necessarily limited in scope, creating a synthesis is like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle for which most of the pieces are missing, and with many of its available pieces not fully formed. Considering the 3 issues presented, you might be tempted to conclude that reviewing original reports of empirical research is difficult. Undoubtedly, it sometimes is. However, if you pick up a topic of interest to you and thoroughly read the research on that topic, you will soon become immersed in a fascinating project. On the vast majority of topics in the social and behavioral sciences, there are at least minor disagreements about the interpretation of the available research data, and often there are major disagreements. Hence, you may soon find yourself acting like a juror, deliberating about which researchers have the most cohesive and logical arguments, which have the strongest evidence, and so on. This can be a difficult but interesting activity. You also might incorrectly conclude that only students who have intensively studied research methods and statistics can make sense of original research reports. While such a background is very helpful, this book was written with the assumption that any intelligent, careful reader can make sense of a body of empirical research if he or she reads extensively on a topic selected for review. Authors of reports of original research do not present statistics in isolation. Instead, they usually provide discussions of previous research on their topics, definitions of basic concepts, descriptions of relevant theories, their reasons for approaching their research in the way they did, and interpretations of the results that are moderated by acknowledgments of the limitations of their methodology. Thus, a skilled author of a report on original empirical research will guide you through the material and make it comprehensible to you, even if you do not understand all of the jargon and statistics included in the report. One final consideration. It is essential that you carefully and thoroughly read all the research articles that you cite in your literature review. Reading only the brief abstracts, summaries, at the beginning of research articles may mislead you because of their lack of detail, and therefore cause you to mislead the readers of your literature review. Thus, it is your ethical responsibility to read each cited reference in its entirety. Theoretical articles. Not every journal article is a report of original research. For instance, some articles are written for the explicit purpose of critiquing an existing theory or to propose a new one. Remember, a theory is a general explanation of why variables work together, how they are related to each other, and especially how they influence each other. As a unified set of constructs, a theory helps to explain how seemingly unrelated empirical observations tie together and make sense. Here is a brief example. Consider the relational theory of loneliness. Among other things, this theory distinguishes between emotional loneliness, utter loneliness created by the lack of close emotional attachment to another person, and social loneliness, feelings of isolation and loneliness created by the absence of a close social network. This theory has important implications for many of social and behavioral research. For instance, this theory predicts that someone who is in bereavement due to the death of a spouse with whom he or she had a close emotional attachment will experience utter loneliness that cannot be moderated through social support. Notice two things about the example given above. First, the prediction based on the theory runs counter to the common sense notion that those who are lonely due to the loss of a significant other will feel less lonely with the social support of family and friends. The theory suggests that this notion is only partially true at best. Specifically, it suggests that family and friends will be able to lessen social loneliness, but be ineffective in lessening more deeply felt and potentially devastating emotional loneliness. Note that it is not uncommon for a theory to lead to predictions that run counter to common sense. In fact, this is a hallmark of theories that make important contributions to understanding human affairs in our physical world. Second, the relational theory of loneliness can be tested with empirical research. A researcher can study those who have lost significant others, asking them about how lonely they feel and the types and strength of support they receive. To be useful, a theory must be testable with empirical methods, which helps the scientific community to determine the extent of its validity. Your job in reviewing literature will be made easier if you identify the major theories that apply to your topic of interest. Writers of empirical research reports often identify underlying theories and discuss whether the results are consistent with them. Following up on the leads they give you in their references to the theoretical literature will provide you with a framework for thinking about the bits and pieces of evidence you find in various reports about specific and often quite narrow research projects that are published in academic journals. In fact, you might choose to build your literature review around one or more theories. In other words, a topic for literature review might be to review the research relating to a theory. It is important to note that a literature review that contributes to a better understanding of one or more theories has the potential to make an important contribution to the writer's field because theories often have broad implications for many areas of concern in human affairs. Literature review articles. Journals often carry literature review articles that is, articles that review the literature of specific topics, much like the literature review that you will write while using this book. Most journals that publish review articles set high standards for accepting such articles. Not only must they be well-written analytical narratives that bring readers up to date on what is known about a given topic, they must also provide fresh insights that advance knowledge. These insights may take many forms, including A. Resolving conflicts among studies that previously seemed to contradict each other, B. Identifying new ways to interpret research results on a topic, and C. Laying out a path for future research that has the potential to advance the field significantly. As a result, going through the process of preparing a literature review is not an easy way to get published in a journal. In fact, when you begin reviewing the literature on a topic, there is no guarantee that you will arrive at the level of insight required to pass the scrutiny of a journal's editorial board. However, if you follow the guidelines outlined in this book, which emphasize first analyzing, i.e., casting a critical eye on it, pulling it apart, sometimes into pieces, and then synthesizing, i.e., putting the pieces back together in a new form, literature, you stand a better chance than the average academic writer of producing a review suitable for publication. It is worth noting that sometimes students are discouraged when they find out their topic has recently been reviewed in an academic journal. They may believe that if the topic was already reviewed, they should set a different topic. That is not necessarily a wise decision. Instead, these students should feel fortunate to have the advantage of considering someone else's labor and insights. That is, of having someone on whose work they can build or with whom they can agree or disagree. Writing is an individual process, so two individuals reviewing the same body of literature are likely to produce distinctly different but potentially equally worthy interpretations and reviews. Anecdotal reports. As you review the literature on a specific topic, you may encounter articles built on anecdotal reports of personal experiences. An anecdote is a description of an experience that happened to be noticed, as opposed to an observation based on research in which there was a considerable planning regarding whom and what to observe, as well as when to observe a particular phenomenon in order to gather the best information. Anecdotal accounts are most common in journals aimed at practicing professionals such as clinical psychologists, social workers, and teachers. For instance, a teacher might write a journal article describing his or her experiences with a severely underachieving student who bloomed academically well in that teacher's classroom. Other teachers may find this interesting and worth reading as a source of potential ideas. But as a contribution to science, such anecdotes are seriously deficient. Without control and comparison, we do not know to what extent this teacher has contributed to the student's progress, if at all. Perhaps the student would have bloomed without the teacher's efforts because of improved conditions at home, or because of a drug for hyperactivity prescribed by a physician without the teacher's knowledge. Given these limitations, anecdotal reports should be used very sparingly in literature reviews, and when they are cited, they should be clearly labeled as anecdotal. Reports on professional practices and standards. Some journals aimed at practicing professionals publish reports on practices and standards, such as newly adopted curriculum standards for mathematics instruction in a state or proposed legislation to allow clinical psychologists to prescribe drugs. When issues such as these are relevant to a topic being reviewed, they may merit discussion in a literature review. The writing process. Now that we have considered the major types of material you will be reviewing, i.e., reports of empirical research, theoretical articles, literature review articles, articles based on anecdotal evidence, and reports on professional practices and standards, we will briefly consider the process you will follow in this book and describe its organization. The first consideration in planning to write a literature review is to recognize your reasons for writing the literature review, as well as to acknowledge who your readers will be. This can range from writing a term paper for a class, to review the literature review chapter of a doctoral dissertation, or even the literature review section of a journal article. These will be important considerations in deciding both the depth of your search for primary materials and the style of your review, sometimes referred to as the writer's voice. Also, an important but often overlooked distinction is made in this book between conducting a literature review, i.e., locating literature, reading it, and mentally analyzing it, and writing a literature review, deciding what you want to say to your readers about your literature, and organizing it in a coherent narrative essay. In other words, writing a literature review involves a series of steps. In the field of composition and rhetoric, these steps collectively are referred to as the writing process. They include A. Managing the search for primary sources. B. Analyzing the information in those sources that is relevant to your area of interest. C. Synthesizing and organizing the information to address a specific topic on which you will focus, and then producing the first draft of the review. And finally, D. Editing and preparing the final draft of the review. The process is much like the one you may have followed in your freshman English class when you were asked to write an analytical essay. We will begin with the first step, which is to recognize why you are writing the literature review and for whom. Finding your writer's voice, writing for a specific purpose. Reviews of empirical search can serve several purposes. They can constitute the essence of a research paper in a class, which can vary in length and complexity depending on the professor's criteria. In a research report in a journal, the literature review is often brief and to the point, usually focusing on providing the rationale for specific research questions or hypotheses explored in the research. In contrast, the literature review in a thesis or dissertation is usually meant to establish that the writer has a thorough command of the literature on the topic being studied, typically resulting in a relatively long literature review. Obviously, these different purposes will result in literature reviews that vary in length and style. Consider the differences in the following types of literature reviews, each of which has a unique and specific purpose. Although the guidelines given in the chapters that follow in this book can apply to any literature review, you will want to vary your approach to the writing task in accordance to your purpose for writing a review. Writing a literature review as a term paper for a class. Writing a literature review as a term paper assignment for a class can be somewhat frustrating because the task involves A. Selecting a topic in a field that may be new to you, B. Identifying and locating an appropriate number of research articles using databases that you may not be familiar with, and C. Writing and editing a well-developed essay, all in about 3 to 4 months. To compound matters, most instructors will expect you to prepare your review of literature outside of class time with minimal guidance from them. Of course, they will also expect your literature review to be thoroughly researched and well written. Fortunately, this book was designed to help you accomplish that. With these difficulties in mind, it is necessary for you to plan your project carefully. First, you should make sure you understand the assignment and know as much as possible about your instructor's expectations near the beginning of the semester. This means that you should not hesitate to raise questions in class regarding the assignment. Keep in mind that if something is not clear to you, it may be unclear to other students, and they will benefit by hearing the answers to your questions. Second, you will need to pace yourself as you undertake the writing process. Make sure you allow sufficient time to follow the steps outlined in this book, including the process of selecting a topic, reading and evaluating the relevant research articles, synthesizing and organizing your notes, writing, redrafting, and revising your paper, and editing it for correctness and adherence to the required style manual. It is helpful to map out the weeks of your school term and lay out a timeline. The following is a suggested timeline for a 15-week semester. Note that this timeline follows the organization of this book into its 4 parts. Example 1.01, suggested timeline for a 15-week semester. Stage 1, preliminary library search and selection of topic, complete by the end of week 3. Stage 2, reading list and preliminary paper outline, complete by the end of week 6. Stage 3, first draft of paper, complete by the end of week 12. Stage 4, revised final draft of paper, complete by the end of week 15. Individual instructors' expectations regarding the length of a written review and the number of references cited may vary widely. For term papers written for introductory survey courses, instructors may require only a short review, perhaps as short as a few double-spaced typewritten pages with a minimum of 5 to 10 references. For such a review, you will need to be highly selective in identifying and citing references, perhaps limiting yourself to those that are the most important and/or most current. For upper division courses, instructors may require longer reviews, which will entail reviewing larger numbers of references. Finally, for graduate level classes in your academic major, your instructor may place no restrictions on length or the number of references, expecting you to review as many research reports as necessary to write a comprehensive literature review on your topic. Given the limited time frame available for writing a term paper, your topic will, of necessity, be narrow. It will help you to look for an area that is well defined, especially if you're new to a field. A good way to select a topic is to examine the subheadings within the chapters of the textbook for your course. For instance, an educational psychology textbook might have a chapter on creativity, with subsections on definitions of creativity, the measurement of creativity, and fostering creativity in the classroom. As an example, suppose you are especially interested in fostering creativity in the classroom. Reading this section, you might find that your textbook author mentions that there is some controversy regarding the effects of competition on promoting creativity, i.e., can teachers foster creativity by offering rewards for its expression? This sounds like a fairly narrow topic that you might start with as a tentative subject. As you search for journal articles on this topic, you might find that there are more articles on it than you need for the term project assignment. If so, you can narrow the topic further by specifying that your review will deal with competition and creativity only in A. elementary school samples and or B. the fine arts. If you are not given a choice of topics but instead are assigned a topic by your instructor, begin your search for literature as soon as possible and promptly report any difficulties you encounter, such as finding that there is too little research on the assigned topic. Perhaps the topic can be broadened, or your instructor can point you to additional sources your literature search did not identify, or that there is too much research. Perhaps the topic can be narrowed, or your instructor can help you identify other delimiters, such as reviewing only recent articles. One consequence of having a short time frame for preparing a literature review as a term paper is that opportunities for feedback on your early drafts will be limited, so you will be responsible for doing much of the editing yourself. When you lay out your timeline, leave room for consulting with your instructor about your first draft, even if this has to be done during an office visit. Finally, the self-editing checklist at the end of the book will help you eliminate some common problems before you submit your paper in final form. Writing a literature review chapter for a thesis or dissertation. The review chapter for a thesis or dissertation is the most complex of the literature review types covered in this book, because you will be expected to prepare the initial literature review as part of your research proposal, well before you begin your actual research. Conducting a literature review is one of the steps you will follow in the process of defining the research questions for your study, so you will probably have to define your topic and revise your research questions several times along the way. Students writing a literature review chapter frequently ask, how many research articles must I cite? In addition, they ask, how long should I make the review? Some students are frustrated when they learn that there is no minimum either on the number of research articles to review or on the length of a review chapter. Often, standards regarding depth and length will vary, depending on the nature of the topic, the amount of research on it, and the expectations of your thesis chair. You should establish two main goals for your literature review. First, attempt to provide a comprehensive and up-to-date review on the topic. Second, try to demonstrate that you have a thorough command of the field you are studying. Keep in mind that the literature review will serve as the basic rationale for conducting your research, and the extent to which you will accomplish these goals will contribute in large measure to how well your project will be received. Note that these goals reflect the seriousness of the task you have undertaken, which is to contribute to the body of knowledge in your field. Several traditions that have evolved through the years reflect how seriously academic departments view the writing of a thesis or dissertation. These include the defense of the research proposal, the defense of the finished thesis or dissertation, and the careful scrutiny of the final document by the university prior to its acceptance as a permanent addition to the library's holdings. Some students procrastinate when it comes to writing a literature review chapter for a thesis or dissertation. After all, usually there are no set timelines. Therefore, it is important for you to set deadlines for yourself. Some students find it useful to plan an informal timeline in collaboration with the committee chair, perhaps by setting deadlines for completing the various steps involved in the overall process. The guidelines described in this book will be helpful in this regard. You should adopt a regular pattern of consultation with the professors on your committee to ensure that you remain focused and on task. Finally, the level of accuracy expected in a thesis or dissertation project is quite high. This will require that you edit your writing to a level that far exceeds what may be expected in a term paper assignment. Not only must your writing conform to the particular style manual used in your field, but it should also be free of mechanical and grammatical errors. The guidelines in Chapter 12 and the self-editing checklist at the end of the book will help you accomplish this. Make sure that you allow sufficient time to set your draft aside for a few days before editing your writing, and expect to use the self-editing guide several times before you give your advisor a draft of the review. Writing a literature review for a research article. The literature review section of a research article published in a journal is the most straightforward of the three types of reviews covered in this book. These literature reviews are usually shorter and more focused than the other types because their major purpose is to provide the background and rationale for specific and often very narrow research projects. On the other hand, these reviews undergo a level of scrutiny that may exceed even that of a review for a thesis or dissertation. Research article submissions for referred journals are routinely evaluated by 2 or 3 of the leading scholars in the area in which the research was conducted. This means that the literature review should not only reflect the current state of research on the topic, but it should also be error-free. Again, the self-editing checklist should be carefully applied. Frequently, an author will write a journal article a year or more after the research was conducted. This often happens when students decide to write shorter article-length versions of their thesis or dissertations, or when they reframe a chapter or two into an article-length manuscript. If this applies to you, search the latest issues of the journals in your field to make sure that your literature review cites the latest work published on your topic. Although there is some variation among journals, the literature review in a research article for a journal is usually expected to be combined with the introduction. In other words, the introduction to the research is framed as a short essay that introduces readers to both the topic and the purpose of the research while providing an overview of the relevant literature. Therefore, in preparing a research article, the emphasis of the review should be on establishing the scientific context in which a particular study was conducted and on the contributions it makes to the field. It should help to demonstrate the rationale for the original research reported in the article. As such, it is typically much more narrow and focused than a literature review chapter for a thesis or dissertation. The parts of this text. Managing the Literature Search Part 1. As noted, this book is organized into 4 parts. Part 1 of this book describes how to manage literature search. This is an essential part of the planning to write phase of the writing process. The current chapter provides an overview of the topic of academic literature reviews. Next, Chapter 2 guides you through the process of becoming familiar with the digital landscape of your university's library. Once you have mastered the digital search mechanics you have identified the principal digital databases for your field and topic, Chapter 3 assists you in conducting the process of surveying the totality of titles available in the databases you have targeted. Using a combination of keywords associated with each article, subject guides, and other resources available through your library, you will carefully refine your list to titles and use them in preparing a tentative written description of the topic of your review. The steps in Chapter 3 will assist you in refining your list of topics in order to identify the set of articles you plan to include in your review. Chapter 4 ends Part 1 with a description of how to organize your collection of articles in ways that will facilitate the collection of information from their contents. You will learn how to scan the articles and then group them according to a set of categories you develop, which will assist you in recording your notes in an orderly format that can be sorted and reorganized easily. Analyzing the relevant literature, Part 2. Part 2 of the book deals with the process of sifting through the information presented in the articles you have selected and organizing the information to address the specific topic that is the focus of your review. To begin the analysis of primary sources, you will need to read and gather specific information from each of the articles you have assembled. And Chapter 5 gives you a step-by-step guidance in accomplishing this analysis. In other words, as you read, you separate the author's prose into its parts or elements. Because you will be analyzing a number of articles, you will need to prepare a systematic collection of notes. Part of the analysis process is sifting the elements on which you made notes, retaining the pertinent ones, and discarding those you do not need. It is sometimes necessary to read and analyze the literature from a more specialized perspective. For instance, if your literature review is part of a research study you are planning to conduct, you will want to pay special attention to Chapter 6, Analyzing Quantitative Research Literature, and Chapter 7, Analyzing Qualitative Research Literature. These chapters provide a brief overview of more technical issues in analyzing these types of research. The final step before you begin to write your first draft of your review is to organize your notes by assembling them into logical groupings. Chapter 8 describes a number of possible ways to arrange the information into formats that will facilitate greatly the actual writing of the draft that you are about to begin. Writing the first draft of your literature review. Part 3. Part 3 carries you through the steps leading to the writing of the first draft of your literature review. Having followed the steps in Part 2, you are now able to begin creating a synthesis of the material you have read, which involves putting the parts from your notes back together into a new whole, a new organizational framework that supports your own point of view. Think of it like this: each of the articles you read constitutes its own whole, but you must now create your own new whole made up of the parts or elements from the collection of articles you have read. That is the essence of Chapter 9. As part of this process, you will need to describe your evaluation of the quality and importance of your research you have cited. Now you are more ready to write your first draft. With your audience in mind, decide whether you will write in a formal or less formal voice. An effective writer is aware of the reader's expectations and writes in a way that will meet those needs. For instance, a term paper written for a professor who is knowledgeable in a particular field is different from a literature review written for a thesis, which may be read by readers who are curious, but not necessarily knowledgeable about a topic. A literature review in a thesis is different from a literature review in an article intended for publication in a journal, or in a research paper written for a class. You should also identify the major subtopics and determine the patterns that have emerged from your notes, such as trends, similarities, contrasts, and generalizations. These steps are covered in Chapter 10. Once you have your first draft in hand, you will need to make sure that your argument is clear, logical, and well supported, and that your draft is free of errors. Chapter 11 will ensure that your argument makes sense to you and to your readers. Editing and preparing a final draft for your review. Part 4. The final two chapters of this book, which comprise Part 4, coincide with the last two steps in the writing process: editing and redrafting your review. These steps are iterative, i.e., they are meant to be repeated. It is not uncommon for a professional writer to rewrite a draft 3 or more times, each time producing a refined, a new and improved draft. Chapter 12 provides guidelines on how to approach the process of editing your essay and incorporating feedback from your readers. And Chapter 13 provides a detailed overview of how to prepare reference lists consistent with the principles outlined in the Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association, APA, which is the most frequently used style manual in the social and behavioral sciences. Once these steps are completed, you are ready to submit your final product, your finished product, to its intended audience, be it your course instructor, your thesis chair, or your editor, or the editor of the journal for which it was targeted. As noted, the editing and redrafting process is iterative, so you can expect to receive suggestions or changes, additions, and or restructuring that will no doubt result in a new and improved final version of your review. Activities for Chapter 1. 1. Locate an original report of empirical research in your field. Read it and respond to the following questions. Note that your instructor may want to assign a particular research article for this activity. You will learn how to locate journal articles on specific topics by reading the remaining chapters in Part 1 of this book. At this point, however, your reference librarian or instructor can help you identify specific journals in your field that are available in your college library. Now, referring to the research article you have located or which your instructor has assigned, respond to the following questions. A. Are there any obvious sampling problems? Explain. Do not just read the section under the subheading sample because researchers sometimes provide additional information about the sample throughout the reports, especially in the introduction, where they might point out how their sample is different from those used by other researchers, or near the end, where they might discuss the limitations of the sample in relation to the results. B. Are there any obvious measurement problems? Explain. C. Has the researcher examined only a narrowly defined problem? Explain. D. Did you notice any other flaws? Explain. E. Overall, do you think the research makes an important contribution to advancing knowledge? Explain. 2. Read the first sample literature review, Review 1, near the end of this book, and respond to the following questions. Note that you will want to read this review again after you've learned more about the process of writing a literature review. The questions below ask only for your first general impressions. Later, you will be able to critique the review in greater detail. A. Have the reviewers clearly identified the topic of review? Have they indicated its delimitations? For instance, it is limited to a certain type of individual or a certain period of time. Does it deal only with certain aspects of the problem? B. Is the literature review written as a cohesive essay that guides you through the literature from subtopic to subtopic? Explain. C. Have the reviewers interpreted and critiqued the literature? Or have they merely summarized it, give examples, and discuss? D. Overall, do you think the reviewers make an important contribution to the knowledge through their synthesis of the literature? Explain.